Hello and welcome to another episode of Open to Question. My guest today is Sanjay Hegde, senior Supreme Court lawyer and a leading voice for civil rights. He worked for a decade as an advocate on record for the state of Karnataka, that is, he represented the state government in the Supreme Court. Since 2015, he has been one of the lead lawyers for an Ahmedabad based NGO in the Supreme Court, where the petitioner has demanded higher compensation for the 2002 Gujarat riot victims. He has also represented a client who had filed a plea in the Supreme Court seeking a ban on cow vigilante groups. And a third group that he has represented are of people who were declared foreigners by the NRC tribunal. The, Thanks to the high reputation that Mr. Hegde enjoys, the Supreme Court appointed him as one of the two amicus curiae to assist the court in the 2012 rape and murder case, and some years later appointed him to mediate in the Shaheen Bagh protest. In 2019, his own Twitter account was suspended. Sanjay Hegde is therefore eminently suited to talk to us about Article 19 of the Indian Constitution that grants all citizens the right to freedom of speech and expression and the right to assemble peaceably and without arms. Of course, since the time these rights were inserted in the Constitution, two constitutional amendments have placed what are called reasonable restrictions on these freedoms. Over the years, therefore, Indian citizens exercising these two rights have been punished by the many arms of the state and their freedoms curtailed. Of late, such instances have grown, and the response from the law enforcement agencies has very often not been even handed. My first question, therefore, Sanjay Hegde, refers to a Supreme Court ruling that came in today. The Supreme Court, referring to former BJP spokesperson Nupur Sharma's controversial remarks on the Prophet Muhammad, said, and I quote the Honorable Court, she is single-handedly responsible for what is happening in the country. Her loose tongue has set the entire country on fire. She should apologize to the whole country. Her outburst is responsible for the unfortunate incident at Udaipur, close quotes. The court was referring to the beheading of a tailor in the Rajasthan district earlier this week, which has sparked huge tension. The Supreme Court's comments came in response to Ms. Sharma requesting the court to get all the first information reports filed against her in different parts of the country transferred to Delhi. Would you like to comment on this particular case and how it underscores the limits to free speech, especially the reasonable restrictions that were imposed through constitutional amendments, that nothing that is said in the public space should lead to violence or disturb public order?
Well, Smita, I'm a bit technologically challenged, and can you see me?
Yes, of
Because
course, I can see you clearly.
I can't. Anyway, be that as it may,
Right.
the point is this: that the case today, as far as Nupur Sharma was concerned, was actually a plea by Nupur Sharma saying that, look, there are FIRs filed all over the country. Please consolidate them, uh, join them to the the FIR filed by the Delhi police, and let investigation go on. At which point of time, the court was basically reacting to the plea and said that no, this is not a liberty that we feel inclined to give you, more particularly in the face of conduct which they made certain comments about. Now, you asked about the limits of free speech. See, there was this classic paragraph uh, in the 1920s by Justice Holmes, which is the basis of all free speech jurisprudence. It's in a case called U.S. versus Abrams, where Justice Holmes said that the answer to a speech is a speech. He was essentially saying that if there is something that is said, there's nothing which prevents somebody else from saying the contrary, and uh, uh, both kinds of speech work their way through the marketplace of ideas, so that the public at large can make up their own mind. But he was saying that 100 years ago, you barely had telephones. If you said something, uh, newspapers may print it, may not print it. Newspapers again uh, were sort of geographically challenged. They would cover a major city or two, and that was about it. But now we live in a different. The same Justice Holmes, at a later stage, came out with another aphorism. He said, "Freedom to speak does not mean freedom to shout fire in a crowded theater." So if you shout fire in a crowded theater, obviously they will cause a panic and probably a stampede and lead to people's death. So you can't use your freedom of speech to cause mischief. Even Holmes drew that line. Now the uh, in today's world, all that got to do to speak is to just tweet it out, put it out on a video, and quite apart from freedom of speech, there is this, uh, I won't say freedom, but there is this question of reach. Anything and everything gets multiplied manifold. And you may have said something in a particular context, it can be taken amiss, and it can have an impact worldwide. So, therefore, if you are representing a major party, a ruling party at the center, there are limits to what you can say and if violence ensues as a consequence of your speech, then you can't run away from responsibility. I think that's what the Supreme Court basically intended to tell Nupur Sharma. And so we have freedom of speech. You can make laws which can reasonably restrict that freedom in the interests of the sovereignty and integrity of India, the security of state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency, or morality, or in relation to contempt of court, defamation, or incitement to an offense. These are the various subjects on which your freedom of speech can be restricted by law. That is the general matrix of the constitutional provision on freedom of speech.
So what you're saying is that these restrictions that you mentioned, of course, came through constitutional amendments. So,
Yes.
what you're saying is that as India progressed from independence and actually became a democracy that in progress, a democracy in progress, our rulers realized that there were certain problems in having unfettered freedom. Is that what you're saying?
No, 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 not exactly. You see, the amendment was also made, it was the first amendment, which was made by the same Constituent Assembly which had brought in the restriction, which had brought in the Constitution, and even the original provision had a restriction. Because the original
Right.
provision said that nothing in subclause A of clause 1 shall affect the operation of any existing law so far as it relates to or prevents the state from making any law relating to libel, slander, defamation, contempt of court, or any other matter which offends against decency or morality, or which undermines the security of or tends to overthrow the state. So there were restrictions. There was an enabling provision to make laws which could impose restrictions in the interests of these particular objectives. Now, it's a bit of a misnomer to say there is freedom of speech with reasonable, but there are reasonable restrictions,
Yeah.
and that often ends up in reasonable restrictions ending the right, eating up the right itself.
Huh.
What the Constitution basically says is that yes, you have freedom of speech, but the state is also entitled to make laws restricting that freedom and in for certain particular policy interests, and then you can't say that those laws infringe your freedom of speech. So while I don't go by that familiar hashtag freedom of speech with restrictions. What I say is that there is freedom of speech, but the government also has the freedom to restrict it only for specific purposes.
Uh, Today, while the Supreme Court refused Ms. Sharma relief, it also underscored, and I open quotes, when you lodge a complaint against someone, that person is arrested, but nobody dares to touch you. That shows your clout, close quotes. The court was referring to alt news journalist Mohammed Zubair, who had highlighted Ms. Sharma's comments on the Prophet and was arrested by the Delhi police on Monday over some other tweet that he had posted in 2018. So, do you
Yes.
feel there are two standards operating in this country on free speech?
Well, there are no two standards on free speech when it comes to the courts.
Huh.
But at the same point of time, there is an unequal application of the law when in administering it. So that is where the problem lies.
With
So
this,
that the Delhi police
yeah.
obviously filed an FIR so that other FIRs can be transferred to him to the Delhi police. But when it came to Mohammed Zubair's case, they called him for investigation for one case where he had already got anticipatory bail. Then they suddenly gave him a notice with relation to another case, and shortly thereafter arrested him. They seem to be determined, predetermined to arrest him.
So, do you feel that today we are seeing a larger number of such cases, or has
No, there are a larger number of cases primarily after the onset of social media. You see, previously the common man did not have a microphone. Now anybody can say anything, and then it can be amplified. It can be amplified either by the algorithm of the app itself, or there are so many of these agencies, including the infamous IT cell, which can amplify one set of speech, or it can shout down another set of speech.
I'll just take you back a few years when the Supreme Court appointed you to head a team to talk to protesters at Shaheen Bagh to find a middle ground that neither impeded local movement nor violated people's right to protest. Were you surprised? And can you describe that experience to us?
Well, I've not spoken too much about it. I was surprised when the Supreme Court thought, sort of went into out of the box thinking, and I was sitting in court, and they said, "Why don't you go and speak to them?" Uh, and I really did not have too much of an experience of mediation, and also because the protests were primarily uh, spearheaded by women, or women were the face of the agitation. They also appointed Sadhana Ramchandran, who is a trained mediator, who's done several mediations, uh, which including even among the Ambani family and things like that. So we were sent there to talk to the people, but you see, uh, what our experience helped us as much as we got to listen to a lot of people. And what the protesters often want is somebody listening to them. And through our mediation process, which was covered on the media and all that, they got to speak more to the world without the editorial comment of various news anchors who would either portray one side of the story or the other. But mediating with the crowd out there was at the end of the day, Corona came in, so we did not have really a free hand, and the numbers were told to dwindle by the police, and then they wrapped up the protests. I had several, in addition to the public meets that I went to the Shinebag spot itself, I had several informal meets with various sets of protesters. And what I basically saw was that there was no one person or one set of people who could make a commitment. Each of them agreed, yes, that the protests had gone on far too long, and that there had to be a way out where their right to protest was protected. But at the same point of time, they felt that there had to be the pressure needed to be kept on the government, because if they had shifted from where they were sitting, they thought that then by just sitting in a park, nobody would listen to them. And the government also did not really. We were not the government's nominees. We could not make any undertakings on behalf of the government. Uh, the government also did send a senior IAS officer to deal with us, and we kept communicating. But ultimately, it was the pandemic, which we did not know about, or which nobody knew how to handle at that point of time, which which took the pressure off the streets.
Why did our constitution makers put the right to freedom, to free speech and expression, as well as the right to assemble peaceably and without arms, into the constitution? What makes these two rights so critical for a democracy?
No, the very idea of fundamental rights uh, came from other constitutions, and like it's almost like a bill of rights. And you see, unlike other countries who had forged their constitutions out of some particular crisis or the other, uh, like the United States wrote a short constitution after it won against the British in 1776. You had the French Constitution, which went through several republics. They, our constitution was basically drawn up uh, after the members of the Constituent Assembly had fought against the British, but also had the experience of a particularly violent preceding decade. Not, if you look at the historical context, you have these people sitting there from 46 to 49, towards the end of 49. And what has happened just before that? You had the World War, you had the Jewish Holocaust coming out, you
Right.
had the atom bomb, you had partition violence, you had the murder of the Mahatma. So you had a whole series of great acts of violence uh, perpetrated, particularly when people got too vociferous in their claims and their thinking. And so it, it was 80% a majority of Orthodox Hindus, with President Rajendra Prasad probably being the most Orthodox Hindu of them all, who wrote a magnificent constitution. And so, yeah, the task that they had accomplished was to secure independence from the British. But how do you build free men in a free country? Except by giving them fundamental rights and fundamental freedoms. And so the chapter heading itself is the right to freedom. And 19 says that you will have freedom of speech and expression, freedom to assemble peaceably without arms, to form associations or unions, to move freely throughout the territory of India, to reside and settle in any part of the territory of India, to practice any profession, or to carry on any occupation, trade, or business. So all these components of freedom were specifically written into the Constitution. And of course, freedom of speech is a preeminent value, and it came out first because as unless you can say what you think and what you mean, and unless you can communicate it, no other freedoms can inure to your benefit. So, in fact, I do remember a friend of mine who was sworn in directly as a Supreme Court judge, and I told him a few days before his appointment, I told him, just take care of the freedom of speech, and the rest of the things will follow. It's a bit like that Orwell quote, which we all say, that freedom is freedom to say that 2 plus 2 makes 4. If that's allowed, everything else follows. So you do have to have freedom of speech, but at the same point of time, the restrictions that are there allow freedom of speech to be truly possible. See, it's like saying, you have freedom to move freely throughout the territory of India. But you can't say that because I have that right, I will freely walk along on a railway track, and the train has to stop till as long as I walk on the railway track. That is not how things operate. You have the freedom. It is defined. There are certain no-go areas or certain areas where you can be restricted, but that's about it.
How do you think these rights have played out since independence? I mean, on the whole, satisfactory or no?
On the whole, I don't think it has been satisfactory. That is because, you see, I may be wrong, and this is my freedom of speech, and a lot of people may disagree. But what also happened was that foreign government held together as somewhat of a police state, was then transferred to Indian governance or Pakistani governance. But the structure of the colonial state remained the same. The officers remained the same. And their methods of working remained the same. And rather than reinvent or anything, people just carried on with it. So we never have had a situation where you have created free men and women
Hmm.
who who can say that this is my inalienable right.
Hmm.
And it's not because it's written in the constitution, it's because I am a human,
Hmm.
I am born in this country, and I'm a citizen of this country.
Hmm.
And the state can't take over those rights. Those are no go areas as far as the state is concerned. That kind of thinking has not really happened in India. We generally have a tendency to say, okay, yes, I have some rights, but the state is all powerful, the state can restrict, and therefore I will exercise my rights only to the extent that I really am forced to.
Hmm.
We've we've in India, you see, actually, I mean, for the past for recorded history, I've I've very rarely heard of an Indian monarch
Hmm.
who has been overthrown by the public for bad governance or for
Hmm.
any other reason.
Hmm.
We, uh, the English Constitution,
Hmm.
a lot of it, including the limitation of the right of the monarch,
Hmm.
came about through the parliamentary revolution, and the execution of King Charles.
Hmm.
The French Revolution, to whom we owe so much of the Indian Constitution,
Hmm.
comes about in particularly bloody times, which had both Louis the 16th as well as leaders of the French Revolution also being executed. So uh, we had a freedom struggle, we had partition violence,
Hmm.
but we also had men of reasonably great foresight at that particular point of time,
Hmm.
came together to cobble up something for the country,
Hmm.
uh, which had a certain amount of flexibility. But you see, even when they wrote it, did they think it through in terms of a Jefferson in writing the American Constitution? I have my little doubts there. You see, they. I told you that these are inalienable rights of man,
Hmm.
but uh, since some 20 odd years after the Constitution, during the emergency, an argument was made that even the right to life comes from the Constitution. And if you take it away from the Constitution, you don't have a right to life in the country. That was the ADM Jabalpur case. And the Supreme Court, 4-1 during the emergency, actually said yes, that even the right to life can be suspended in a constitution, in an emergency. So the idea that these are inalienable rights which are recognized and put as fundamental in the Constitution, that really hasn't uh, fully got into the social psyche, as it were.
Right. You just mentioned the emergency. Uh, I mean, we all know about the curbs that were placed during the emergency on free speech and public protest and so on. Why is that different from what is happening only too often now without imposing emergency? Or am I exaggerating?
No, I don't think you are exaggerating, but I was too young during the emergency to exactly figure out what was going on. I was 10 years old. I do have memories of my father coming home and telling my mother, "Look, Indira Gandhi's become a dictator." My father had some political affiliations, and he did think that there were people shadowing him, and there was conversation to the effect that what happens in case I get picked up and things like that. But as the eldest son, those fears were in fact communicated to me. But I think the best story about the emergency was what Mr. Nariman narrated, and it's narrated in his biography till his autobiography till memory fades, where he says that he went into the Supreme Court bar library, and then there was the great Mr. C.K. Daftari, who had earlier been Attorney General of India, sitting there smoking his pipe, And Mr. S.T. Desai, who had retired as a Chief Justice of a High Court and had come to the Supreme Court to practice. And he sort of, there was a very brief conversation which encapsulated the emergency for Mr. Nariman, and I think where Justice S.T. Desai looked at C.K. Daftari and said, "Haan, Chandubai, bolo." And Mr. Daftari was tapping his pipe and putting it right, and then looked at him and with a glint in his eye said, "Pehla tame bolo." You speak first. So that was the emergency. Not, and let's speak. But now, uh, the point is that there is a certain amount of speech. Uh, I'm speaking to you, people are watching this, but it is also quite possible that if speech goes out of hand, the consequences can be much worse. I don't think in the emergency people's houses got bulldozed. I don't think that during the emergency that Sanjay Gandhi's stormtroopers, the youth Congress could turn up at your house and go through the contents of your fridge and cause violence thereafter. Now you have this overwhelming sense or that if not the state, there could be other enforcers as well. And so I'm sure that Mr. Daftari would have probably said, "Abhe bolna band karo."
Yeah. So, what implications does this have for India's future as a democracy?
If we start self-censoring ourselves totally for fear of consequences, then you know we will soon not end up not coming out with fresh ideas or anything. It will be a shutting down of our democracy. But I do not also advocate what shall we say? As they say, liberty cannot become license. You should have free speech to criticize uh, government. Freedom of speech is there for unpopular speech. Popular speech doesn't need any protection. If you ask the Prime Minister, how do you eat your mangoes? And how nicely you eat your mangoes, that doesn't need any free speech protection. Free speech protection should be available against the state as well as any uh, private militia or any violent people whom the state has not been able to police. There was a uh, Russian dissident called Nathan Sharansky who propounded the Sharansky test of free speech. He said that if in the public square you cannot criticize your government without fear of arrest or violence, then you're not living in a free country. So I we are in a position where people are already thinking, people are already self-censoring, but yet there are many people who are speaking up. Are they speaking? Are they fully speaking out? That I don't know.
In late 2019, you had your Twitter account suspended. I believe you've challenged it in court, but it has not yet been renewed.
Yes, I did challenge it in the Delhi High Court in a writ petition.
Hmm.
Now, you see, uh, I was telling you about the power of reach.
Hmm.
Now, what is it that allows us to amplify our speech?
Hmm.
It is platforms like Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and
Hmm.
all these are private corporations.
Hmm.
Now, a private corporation can do anything. A shopkeeper can say that, look, I will not sell you X, Y, or Z. So, when we go on these platforms, do they own us? So, my argument, and that's an argument which has to be examined,
Hmm.
and I hopefully will be examined soon because the Delhi High Court has now started substantial hearings of the case, and it will now be heard in July, later this month. Uh, my argument was that when these corporations deal with the public square,
Hmm.
with speech in the public square, they are performing a public function. And if they are performing a public function, they are amenable to the writ jurisdiction of the courts in India. If they regulate the public square in India, then they have to regulate it in accordance with the constitution. These kind of questions have also uh, been asked abroad. Uh, Former President Trump filed a suit, lost the suit, but he's filed an appeal. At least one judge of the SCOTUS, much reviled Clarence Thomas, has expressed some doubts about these private corporations totally controlling the public square, and whether they should be not amenable to any kind of regulation by the government. These are questions on free speech which will probably agitate the courts and legislators over the next decade or two.
Um, just a few days ago, on June 28th this year, the G7 leadership issued a joint statement in Germany. Uh, and the statement said that the signatories were committed to protecting the freedom of expression and opinion online and offline, and ensuring a free and independent media landscape through our work with relevant international initiatives. They also promised to guard the freedom, independence, and diversity of civil society actors, speak out against threats to the civic space, and respect freedom of association and peaceful assembly. India, as you know, is the signatory to this statement. Do you think there's a gap between the commitment that the Indian government made at that G7 meeting and the way its law enforcement agencies work at home?
Well, there was an old cartoon of R.K. Lakshman in the 1970s,
Hmm.
which said that, of course, we promised socialism to the country, but we promised it to the people, and we'll give it to them first. And this was a minister sitting in a big bungalow saying it.
Huh.
So it's the same kind of thing. Yes, yes, we have these all these things we intend to do. Yes, we are not fully there, but we are progressing towards it. And yes, whatever happens is a little abrasion, little exception here and there. But the fact that they have signed it uh, does not necessarily mean that they will immediately implement it.
You use the word immediately. You think in the future they will implement it?
In the future, who knows? No government is immortal, is it? And no people uh, take kindly to being muzzled for considerable lengths of time. You see, the history of mankind shows that, especially when there is repression, the level of humor, at least, gets more and more sophisticated. During the old Soviet Union, it was said that a commissar asked a peasant, uh, how has been the potato crop? And the peasant says, "Oh, if it has been wonderful, comrade. If all the potatoes that have grown were all stacked up together, they would touch the very heavens and touch the feet of God." So the commissar says, "Comrade, there's no God." So the peasant says, "There are no potatoes either." So it's like that.
Okay, there's a question from a viewer. You
Yes.
have gone over it, but anyway, since the person has asked it, Saket Pipalwa has asked, if I have an opinion on something, can't I openly express it on Twitter or other social media?
Well, you have the right to express your opinions, but there are already laws in relation to, say, defamation, in relation to contempt of court, in the criminal law in respect of spreading hatred between communities. So, yes, please, by all means, go ahead, express your opinion, but be careful that the law can be set in motion against you. But that is a consequence of a civilized society. Now, the fear these days, however, is that in addition to the law, there are these extra legal actors against whom enforcement doesn't provide you any remedy. There was that. I mean, there was this case in Bombay where, at the time of Bal Thackeray's funeral, some
That's right.
girls commented that, look, so much has been shut down. Why should it have been shut down? And you had a whole army of people descend on them till they apologized. So, does your law enforcement is your law enforcement strong enough to stand up against the mob? And then can you trust your law enforcement to protect you from the mob? Now, here is a sort of curious anomaly, and this is where I often use that phrase called thanedar justice. Now, I told you that at the end of the day, the country is often run the way a policeman wants it, saying that, let's keep order, let us not have too many problems in my ilaka or my beat area. So now, if somebody says something untoward which leads to a mob attack, what is the safest way for the policeman to diffuse the situation? If he stands up against the mob and fights out there, then the mob can come after him, or then there can be further inquiries, this, that, and the other. So the safest thing is to simply arrest the person whose statement caused it, put that person in jail, and tell the mob, now you can go home. I have taken action. Then thereafter, if the courts release the person or not, that is the court's lookout. He has done his job of restoring order. So we have a kind of silence enforced by thanedars as our minimum standard of free speech.
The election. We are all very proud in this country of our election commission, and it is an election commission that everybody admires around the world. But in the last so many years, we have been seeing that during elections, many politicians forget where they are, and in their sort of anxiousness to win the election, they say things that they shouldn't. But we have seen in the last few elections that even the election commission, of which we are all so proud, has not been even-handed in its,
approach.
judgment, in its approach to these statements about which complaints have been made. So,
You
do you
see,
see this as an erosion of, as an example of an erosion of our institutions?
well, institutions are also often what they want to be. It was the same election commission under Mr. T. N. Session and Mr. Lingdo. It was something quite different. Then, when Mr. Session ran the election commission all by himself,
Hmm.
one of the ways that the Narasimha Rao government used to bring him under control was to appoint two other election commissioners with him and to say that majority would rule on the election commission. So they effectively, in my senior Mr. G. Ramaswamy's picturesque words in the TN Session case, they had the power of fixation of election commissioners, but they used it to fix session. So it was uh, uh, once election commissioners like Mr. Session or Mr. Lingdo were put in their place, then many election commissioners got took their job function as primarily to peacefully conduct elections and then peacefully retire thereafter. Uh, this kind of uh, what shall we say, speech which verges on hate speech and all that was not so much of a problem in an earlier day. And you see, the election commission can often issue advisories or can prevent people from maybe campaigning for some time. But the ultimate recourse is to the courts themselves, and that is much after the elections and when the mischief has already been done. Mr. TN Session, I do remember when there was some particular hanky panky in Patna, he just cancelled the elections to the Patna Lok Sabha, notwithstanding the fact that the candidate was the then sitting Prime Minister, I.K. Gujral. So, uh, with some people, only the big stick works, but not every constitutional authority is willing to wield a big stick.
But in the can an aggrieved politician, aggrieved political party during an election uh, not go to the election commission but go to the courts?
They can go to the court after the election,
Not during the election.
not during the election, not before the election. That has been the law in the country since the 1950s, from a judgment called Punnuswamy's case, where there's something problematic about the conduct of the election of one particular elections, and the court said no. Let the election be over. You come to us. We'll sort out what we can, but we are not going to interfere during the course of elections, and we are not certainly not running the elections ourselves.
And do you think that is how it should be, or do you think there should be a change?
I don't think courts are designed to do much more than give rulings on disputes according to the law as stated. Uh, uh, Courts, as it is, are overburdened, and the more jurisdictions that they get into, the more questions that then get raised. So I for one would not want courts getting into election and uh, election violations. The election commission itself could possibly be split into two. One one part of it handling the elections, the conduct of elections, and another part of it uh, handling everything that comes before an election, including the campaign, including the speeches, and that particularly sort of, if it had a in-house tribunal of its own, which could give speedy orders. No, you can't do this, or you can't do this. I think that might go a long way.
And finally, as a lawyer and a prominent voice for civil rights, what is your advice to the ordinary Indian citizen in these difficult times?
In these difficult times, what I would say is uh, speak your mind, do not be afraid, but at the same time, do not use your speech to cause violence, or do not use your speech to unnecessarily hurt any particular section of people simply because they belong to that particular section. But I do not think voluntary submission to self censorship is healthy for this country and for our democracy. Uh, a simpler formula is to ensure that your speech always punches up and does not punch down, or against weak people who are weaker than you or below you or subordinate to you in any way.
Sanjay Hegde, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Smita. It was a pleasure talking to you.